Hello, my name is Russell Myers. Welcome to Issues Unite. So, just about everyone has heard with it that a couple of days ago, there was a farm in Poland which was struck by a missile. And since then, there have been different claims that were thrown around. But we've got to give our condolences, first of all, to the people, that the civilians at this farm that were killed in this event. They were just going about their regular working day, and this happened. But I also I want to give praise to Poland for not jumping straight into some wild claim. They said, no, we're going to investigate this, even though within minutes the Ukrainian government was claiming that this was a Russian attack on a NATO country and NATO needed to get involved. Now, Ukraine has been trying to get NATO drawn into this from the very beginning, which is absolutely foolish. If NATO and Russia wind up in a conflict, Ukraine itself is going to be annihilated. But likewise, I'm going to state that Poland is going to be a lot more reserved about this because with the current field of battle, if NATO and Russia wind up in an armed conflict, then the next country that is going to be the front line is going to be Poland. So they're not hot on the idea of just jumping in and stating that Russia attacked them. Now, within a few hours, I've got to give Poland also credit for publishing the images of the missile debris. The interesting thing about this is that the initial claims was that there were two missiles. That one actually hit this grain dryer where people were working, and the other had not detonated. Well, suddenly the second missile disappeared into the ether. There's no report, there's no images of it. But those were the initial claims, that there were two, not one. The New Atlas also talked about there being two missiles. So he heard the same reports I did. And all of a sudden, there's no talk about the second missile. All right, so Poland said that this was an S-300, a standard S-300 missile. So we got to look at a few characteristics of the S-300. The first thing that you got to take a look at is, what is the range of an S-300 missile? A standard S-300 missile has a range of 150 kilometers or 93 miles. Okay, so Poland said clearly the only place this could have come from would have been within Ukraine. What did Ukraine do? They doubled down and said, no, this was a Russian attack. Well, let's take a look at distances. There's no way, with over 1,000 kilometers, that an S-300 flew from Russia to Poland. So let's take a look at this. Here is the town that was hit, Przewodał, in Poland. So I looked at the nearest town. This is a town in northwestern Ukraine. The distance from this town to the Polish farm is 151 to 158 kilometers. And then you got another 10 kilometers at least up to Belarus, which would be the nearest Russian allied territory. Now, unless it was attacked, it was launched from the very bottom tip of Belarus, which is still 151 to 158 kilometers. And that would have to be a very intentional targeted attack. Why wouldn't they, if that was a thing, then why wouldn't they hit Lublin in Poland? The distance is actually shorter, and it would be a more appropriate target. So it makes no sense no matter what. Russia doesn't want war with NATO. NATO doesn't really want war with Russia. And yet, Ukraine continues to deny any responsibility. Keep in mind, Ukraine has denied responsibility for the attack on the Crimean Bridge. They've denied a responsibility for the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline. One of the first things that came to mind for me was the similarity here between this and MH17, Malaysian Airlines MH17, which was shot down over Ukraine in 2014, right after the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government by right-wing extremists. At the time of MH17, first, several days before that, another aircraft had been shot down over Ukrainian airspace. They should have had their airspace closed. There was intense fighting that was going on between Donbass and Ukraine at the time, and yet they did not close their airspace, and this event occurred. So 8 years The Hague has been considering this, and all of a sudden, the day after this Polish farm was attacked, The Hague comes to the conclusion to convict in absentia 3 people, 2 Russians and 1 Ukrainian. There was a 4th defendant that had representation in court. The 3 that were convicted had no representation. So there were a lot of things that were not taken into consideration by The Hague, and things that have not been publicized. The U.S. claims to have radar imaging, satellite imaging that proves that there was something, that this was these were Russians. This was a Russian attack. And yet the satellite imaging and radar records have not been publicized, and it's questionable whether the court ever took that into consideration. In addition, Russia has submitted evidence, records, which show that the missile which hit that airliner was produced in Ukraine during the USSR era, and it never left Ukraine. And yet there's these claims that it was produced in Ukraine, and then after the fall of the USSR, it was transported over to Russia and then transported back to Ukraine, and then after the attack, it was transported back again. How do you transport a weapon back to Russia after it's been fired? So, evidence that was not considered, that was highly applicable. Obviously, The Hague does not consider court-appointed attorneys to be a thing, and after 8 years with no determination, all of a sudden they come to a final decision on MH17 the day after the Polish event. Coincidence? I kind of don't think so. In addition, Ukraine has denied involvement with MH17, the Crimean Bridge, the Nord Stream pipeline, and they've denied that they were even attacking Donbass for 8 years, even though this has been widely reported in Western media for the whole 8 years until this year. That was being reported by Western media. It was reported by Human Rights Watch, the UN, etc. The New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, etc. You can look these reports up. And yet, Ukraine claims that they weren't even attacking Donbass. They have lost all credibility, and they're going to lose support. Nobody is actually claiming, I have my own doubts and questions, but no international, the U.S., Poland, NATO are not stating that Ukraine did this on purpose, but Ukraine doubles down. About all that Poland probably wants is an apology. There is one Polish mayor that has said that this was an intentional provocation by Ukraine to try and draw NATO into this. If I did not mention another similarity between MH17 and this event, I got to hold on. All right, let's not do that. Is that there was intense fighting between Donbass and Ukraine in 2014 when MH17 happened. This event happened while Russia was conducting the largest airstrikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, etc., since February or March. Interesting that the West keeps on claiming that Russia is running out of long-range missiles, even though they've been conducting these long-range strikes for weeks and then intensified it. But so there was fighting back then and fighting now, and the similarities are just too striking to ignore. The West is still claiming that Russia takes responsibility for this Polish farm attack because it wouldn't have happened if not for the fact that Russia was attacking Ukraine. So no matter what happens, it's always going to be Russia's fault. Back in 2019, when Zelensky was elected, I was paying attention to what was happening. Most Americans had probably never heard of Ukraine, never heard of Donbass, didn't know anything. They can't point to Ukraine on a map now. But I was happy when Zelensky was elected because he ran on a platform of ending the Donbass conflict and improving relations with Russia. I was happy until it was very evident that it was all a lie. But that's why the Ukrainians elected him. They did not elect him to cause World War III and destroy their own country. I have my own suspicions that most of the people that have evacuated from Ukraine actually do not support this war in any way. It would be very difficult to take a poll of them with them spread out across multiple countries, but the fact that this was his platform and this was why he was elected, that tends to say an awful lot in my mind. So I am rather hoping that with Ukraine refusing to take any accountability for absolutely anything is going to mean that they are losing more and more credibility, more and more political support from Western governments, especially from Europe, which is going into winter now. There's going to be a massive refugee crisis coming out of Ukraine into Europe, putting more strain on the European infrastructure. They've already got a shortage of housing and jobs, and their utility bills. They've got a shortage of energy. They're expecting blackouts across Europe this winter, shutting down entire industries, and now they're going to take in millions more Ukrainians. I'm hoping that this means, decreased support. More and more Western governments, including the U.S. in some ways, are trying to pressure Ukraine to hold peace talks. And yet, any time that Zelensky or any Ukrainian official speaks publicly, they're always begging for more money, more weapons, and trying to draw NATO into this directly. And that is not going to happen. So, at some point, there is a tipping point. The United States alone has given or dedicated $93 billion to Ukraine since February alone. And that's not counting what we gave them the previous 8 years since the right-wing overthrow of the democratically elected government. So, if nothing else, we can really only hope that Europeans are going to start protesting in such massive numbers that eventually, Ukraine is going to be forced to hold peace talks. That that Western governments are going to, at least European, if not American, it's unlikely America is going to be there, but at least force their governments to stop supporting Ukraine. So eventually, if Zelensky refuses to negotiate, then I think it may come to a point where NATO and the U.S. and Russia sit down, take it out of Zelensky's hands, and they negotiate some kind of arrangement and take it completely out of his hands. If they refuse to keep on supporting this, or, they could make it an absolute condition of any support that he sit down at a negotiating table in good faith. That's what needs to happen. We need peace talks. This cannot continue. All right, so share this video, talk about these subjects. If you can afford it, please donate whatever you can to help expand this channel and my presidential campaign, and I will catch you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Hope you have a good day.